A year ago, the FBI began a nationwide initiative to identify these cold cases. We asked our 56 field offices to re-examine their unsolved civil rights cases and determine which ones could still be viable for prosecution. Since this initiative began, we have been provided with information regarding nearly 100 such cases. Each will need to be assessed for its investigative and legal viability, but the cases in which we can move forward, we will move forward.
In 2007, the FBI announced it was reopening about 100 unsolved murders that happened during the 1950s and 1960s. One of those murders occurred in Ferriday, Louisiana in 1964. One journalist and a group of journalism students from Louisiana State University are working with the FBI to help solve this and other cases.
Frank Morris owned a shoe shop in Ferriday. In 1964, he was 51. He was able to do something that was really unique for the day, is that he developed a very loyal white and black clientele. Suddenly in '64 that became a problem for the Klan. These men were absolutely resolved that they were not going to allow civil rights or any kind of thing like that come into Concordia Parish. And the problem for them became that Frank Morris, when white women would drive up to the shop, and oftentimes Frank would walk out to the lady's car and take their order just because of the racial sensitivity of the day, where a white woman would not have to come into his shop and sit down where other black men might be sitting around. It was just a social taboo. And that, coupled with the fact that Frank had apparently had some run-ins with policemen, particularly with a Concordia Parish deputy named Frank DeLauder. Frank DeLauder was called Big Frank. He was 6'4", 6'5". He weighed 265 pounds. And he was notoriously violent, and he had a terrible reputation, really for just pure meanness.
So this is basically some of the photocopies of the stories that I got from the documents in DC from the National Archives. This piece was interesting because Frank DeLauder, who is one of the people who Stanley believes was involved in the Frank Morris case, he actually was never arrested or indicted for anything in connection to that case. He was indicted for being involved in a beating of a white male, actually. And so one of the FBI's best informants, O.C. Cooney Poisson, he actually gave this interview, and here he talks about how they actually went to the King Hotel and ended up beating William Davis. Well, basically this tells us that, you know, Frank DeLauder was obviously not someone that anyone in the town wanted to mess with. He was big, he was mean, he was basically someone right out of, you know, out of a storybook. You couldn't make up some of the things he did. And he was, you know, obviously had no problem taking someone down to a jail and just beating the living daylights out of him for something that he couldn't even prove.
Some shoes were brought in, either cowboy boots or shoes, and Frank Morris told Frank DeLauder, "I'm not going to do any more work for you until you start paying me." For Frank DeLauder, this Big Frank, this huge, violent deputy, Frank Morris was, quote, being uppity. He was a black man, you know, talking that way to a white man, and we, you know, pretty well believe for certain that was the trigger to the arson. Frank said that he was asleep in a small, tiny back room in the back of his shop, and that sometime after midnight he heard glass breaking, and he got up and walked to the front of the shop, and he saw two white men. One had a shotgun, the other had a gasoline can and was spreading fuel, Frank said, on the outside of the shop. Frank confronted the two men, asked them, "What are y'all doing? Quit that." And then he said something happened, somebody threw a match or they threw something, and the place just exploded in fire. And Frank attempted to go out the front door, which would have been an easy exit for him. Instead, the man with a shotgun pointed it at Frank and said, "Get back in that shop." So Frank had no alternative. Two young Ferriday policemen who were in their early 20s one dead, one still alive. They had left town in the town's lone patrol car. They were on duty that night. They had left town and driven almost to Ferriday, which is about 9 or 10 miles away. And one of the officers told me, the one that's still alive, said that when they arrived back into Ferriday, they noticed the shoe shop was on fire, and they slowed down, and in fact, he said it looked like an explosion. There were pieces of cinder block and material all out in the street. And as they rounded the front of the shop, they saw Frank coming out the back door. Frank was completely naked. It had burned his boxer shorts and his t-shirt off of him. Only the straps remained. He was bleeding. Pieces of skin was falling off of his body. Everywhere he walked, he left a trail of bloody footprints. It was an awful, awful sight. The two officers took him, put him into their car, and took him to the Ferriday Hospital, which was about a mile away. And once there, a short time later, the FBI was notified, and an agent came out of Alexandria, came to Ferriday, and actually interviewed Frank Morris on an IBM dictaphone. And that's why we have an account of what Frank saw that night. An interesting thing about this case and getting old documents and trying to find evidence over a case that's so old is the FBI actually destroyed that recording back in the 1970s. I guess they never thought the case would be opened again, but it was very disappointing to learn that we would not get to hear Frank's voice, because I really hoped to hear him talk, and maybe we could pick up some evidence, but that's gone.
One file I particularly found interesting from our trip to DC was here. It was testimony of Della Mae Smith. Now, Miss Smith was a custodial worker in the hospital where Frank Morris went after his shop was burned. Morris spent a few days in the hospital. His burns would ultimately prove to be fatal, and it was thought for a while that he never really identified anyone while he was in the hospital that did this, but Miss Smith came about. She named both the people that she says he told her did it. The names are redacted in the file for whatever reason. The FBI has a myriad of reasons they keep names from us, but she identified two potential suspects, as well as an interesting motivation. What the thought was that Miss DeLauder actually came on to Morris in some casual way. She did business in his shop on a fairly regular basis, and it was thought that she came in and kind of propositioned him, at which point he told her, politely declined, and told her that he would call her. The story goes that he didn't necessarily call her, but somehow DeLauder got wind of this, and it could have been kind of the straw that broke the camel's back as far as DeLauder ordering the attack on Morris's shop. It's just kind of another little piece in the potential motivation as to why someone would want to burn Frank's shop down, because Frank was a very affable guy. Everybody in town seemed to like him. So the motivation there, obviously racial, but why exactly Frank is something that Stanley has been struggling to understand, and we have too.
I think he probably suspected Big Frank DeLauder was responsible for it. However, there's no question Big Frank DeLauder was easily identifiable. Had Frank Morris saw Frank DeLauder standing outside that shop, he would have been unmistaken in who that was. So I don't believe Frank DeLauder was standing out there. It was a very intensive investigation, and I'm very impressed by those guys, those FBI guys out in the field. They really worked. And in '64, once the fire happened, into '65, they worked it really, really heavily. Even yet, they were still unable to make a case, and the primary problem for that was they could never find a witness that said they heard the perpetrators say, "I did it." Even their best informants, no one would say that. No one pretended to know who actually did it, although everyone suspected somebody. So the case just went cold.
This is another file we found particularly interesting as well as moving that we pulled this semester. It's addressed to Mr. Hoover, and it goes, it was December 18th, 1964. On a cold night about 1 o'clock in the morning, the KKK burned down Frank Morris's shop and him with it. As of now, we have not heard what happened to the killer. It is possible these people are going to get away with this act without being exposed, even though the police was a part of the gang that permitted this terrible thing to happen. Your office is our only hope, so don't fail us. Yours truly, signed, the colored people of Concordia Parish.
Why is this significant to you?
Well, it just kind of goes to show the hopelessness that African Americans in Concordia Parish felt during this time. They had nowhere to turn. They lived in such vile racial oppression. Even law enforcement was in on it. So it's paralyzing fear, because where do you turn? You have no one to turn to. You fear the racists, but you also fear the law enforcement, because they're the same people who are permitting and often taking part in this. So it's real evidence of just how hard and how frightening it was to be an African American living in Concordia Parish at the time.
40-something years ago, with law enforcement being part of the problem, Concordia Parish has never lifted a finger to do anything for Frank Morris or for any other people. And now that the feds have come to our district attorney, who has opened his doors wide open and say, I'll do anything to help you, and the fact that a grand jury was convened with part of its mission to look into the Frank Morris case is really significant. It's a little small step towards justice. It's taken 40-something years, but thank God we're there now. And so what we've got to do is continue the momentum and continue to push the federal government to resolve this case.